am going to talk a little bit about the guidelines, and as you will see today, when we talk about 3D echo, we need to first sort of really get all together and do a really good 2D echo, because if we do a bad 2D echo, the 3D echo is not going to work. So having said that, these are my conflict of interests. And let me just start by telling you that in the year 2005, so approximately 11 years ago, the American Society of Echo got together and we wrote together with the European Association of Cardiovascular Imaging recommendations for chamber quantification. And this first sort of manuscript, just to show you, became rapidly very, very popular. And on those of you who know about writing papers and so on, this paper got cited approximately, now I would say about 7,000 times. So it means that a lot of people read it, or maybe a lot of people who write papers always say that we did it according to the guidelines and never read the guidelines. But that's another issue. But this manuscript got translated into numerous languages, as you can see there, Chinese and French and Spanish. So it got in posters, and so it got a lot of traction. So then, coming 10 years, the American Society of Echo decided that we need to rewrite these guidelines. And that is very pertinent to this meeting today, because you can ask yourself, what happened in those last 10 years that merit a new guideline to be written. And there are three sort of main reasons. The first one is that there are many, many studies that got published in this last 10 years regarding normal values. And as I'll show you, normal values were acquired in different ways. The second thing is that over these last 10 years, we have seen the advent of deformation imaging. So, the strain imaging is something that you will see a couple of talks today. Some of my colleagues are going to present you how you do that nicely with 2D, and now this is still starting now in 3D. We don't know exactly what this all means, but this is all coming. So we have a strain imaging, and also what we have seen over the last 10 years is the advent of three-dimensional echocardiography. And in these guidelines, the new guidelines of last year, for the first time, there is now a recommendation for imaging in 3D of both the left ventricle and the right ventricle. And that's something that you're going to be learning today, how to acquire, what are the different software possibilities to measure things, and so on and so forth. And I think that's sort of interesting. And that also brings us to one of the gaps that Manny wanted me to talk about, is that we don't have normal values in 3D for a lot of parameters. We don't have 3D for the left atrium. We certainly don't have 3D for the right atrium. We don't have 3D for LV mass. So there are a lot of parameters that we cannot recommend normal values because we don't know what these normal values are. And the last reason why we needed to have new guidelines is that as we started to write one guideline, and then the diastole guideline came and the right ventricular guideline came, we started to have discrepancies between these guidelines. So we needed to eliminate these discrepancies. And accordingly, this is now the new guidelines that was published last year that again got a lot of traction, and for reasons that I not know immediately, they are translated into Chinese. And if you can find any typo, let me know. Okay, so So when we talk about these new guidelines, it is important to know, and I'm going to show you some of the differences, is that we only in these new guidelines provide partition values for only ejection fraction, left atrium, and LV mass, and LA size. So these are the only parameters in which we are going to, in these guidelines, tell you what is mild, moderately, and severely dilated. I always like to joke that the best echo labs are the ones that have the biggest amount of adjectives to describe something. Mild, mild to moderate, moderate, moderate to severe, etc. So these are, when you think about it, there is a lot of difficulties on deciding how to perform or to make cutoff values. You can do them based on standard deviations, but the problem is the echo parameters are not normally distributed. You can do it based on percentile values, but we have very few data on that. You can do it based on outcomes. Say a left atrium that is as large as this, you have a bad prognosis, but the outcomes and prognosis varies according to what, if you talk about the left atrium in an athlete, it means differently and so on. So it's very difficult to do it based on outcomes, or you have normal values for many different parameters. Or you can do it based on consensus, and that is sort of interesting. In the previous guideline 10 years ago, I called 8 of my colleagues who sort of direct the biggest echo labs around the country and asked, well, hey, what do you use as normal ejection fraction? And based on that is where the normal values were obtained. So now, having back 10 years, now we are much more robust. In these new guidelines were based on 7 databases performed mostly in Europe and the United States. And there we already start another gap and another problem, is that all of these normal values were obtained predominantly on Caucasian people. And you know that if we take the normal values of Europeans or white Americans, they're going to be very different to Japanese or to people from Thailand. Therefore, the American Society of Echo is now doing a study, it's called the WAYS study, in which we are going to obtain normal values of around 18 different parts of the world and compare them across genders and across ages. The normal values that I am going to talk to you about, these guidelines, they don't have any contrast. So the contrast is not part of this. We, of course, had information of the age, the gender, the ethnicity, the height, and the weight of each of these patients. And what is good is all of these patients were healthy. They didn't have renal insufficiency. They had normal BMIs, and they had normal triglycerides and no diabetes. Now, in this part of the talk, my colleagues we're going to talk about the different types of chambers and so on. So I'm going to predominantly talk about the left ventricle. And this slide tells you a little bit how, for a long period of time, we actually evaluated left ventricular function. We sort of looked at it and made a call. And this qualitative assessment is, of course, subjective. It's very dependent upon the experience of the reader. There is no standardization when you do this type of thing. And of course, this will lead to large inter and intra-observer variability. Now, regarding left ventricular linear measurements, in the guidelines we say that you can obtain these with a 2-dimensional echocardiography from EMOD if you do a 2D targeted, but we are sort of recommending predominantly that linear measurements should be obtained from 2D echocardiographic changes, because in this particular manner you avoid oblique sections of the ventricle. Now, for many years, we would use EMOD echo to derive volumes. And we did that using the Teicholz method and also doing the Quiñones method. This is absolutely now not recommended, because when you use EMODs, you are assuming a certain geometry, if you have a wall motion abnormality, an apical aneurysm, etc., you don't take that into account. So this is definitely not recommended. The new guidelines, you already all know that what we propose is that you do a biplane disk summation method in order to calculate volumes, and that is what theoretically should be happening in every echo lab. And you can then think about it if you are doing it or not, but the biplane disk summation method has the advantage that it corrects for shape distortions. It has less geometrical assumptions compared with linear dimensions. The main problem, and this is something that we would like to demonstrate, is that we many times actually foreshorten the apex. We many times have endocardial dropout, particularly in the apical lateral wall, which makes it difficult at times. So we also propose as number 2 the area length method. The area length method has the advantage that you only need to visually see one point in the apex and not the entire apex, which at times is sort of difficult to do. In these guidelines, all of the parameters are presented in this way. They are dependent according to age, and then we have the biplane, the end diacetyl and systolic volumes. And then we present the mean and the 2 standard deviation. And of course, I'm not going to talk about that because you can go to the manuscript and look at it. But just to make a point that the ejection fraction, when we truly measure it in over 4,000 people, it's different to the ejection fraction that we did by phone. So you can see that in the year 2015, if you have an ejection fraction that is more than 52, it is normal. And there are the partition values. Before it was 55, so it sort of dropped a little bit. And you can say there are partition values for mild, moderate, and severe. And the other thing that came apparent when you really do this in a scientific way is that there is a difference in the values of ejection fraction across genders. And you can see that females have like a 2-point higher ejection fraction compared to males. So maybe Hillary has a chance. So regarding the left ventricular, the left ventricular, and this is now, for the first time, we recommend in these guidelines the use of 3-dimensional echocardiography for the measurement of left ventricular volumes. And there is a very particular sentence in this guideline that say that in laboratories that have experience with 3D measurements and reporting of left ventricular volumes is recommended. And I am assured that if we go over the different types of labs, there are very few people still that are using 3-dimensional echo, despite many of the advantages that I'm going to talk to you. This is one that I think is key. Why is 3D more accurate? Is because 3D echo can actually allow you, when you acquire this pyramid of data, to make your measurements from the true apex of the left ventricle. In that manner, we avoid some of these foreshortenings. And the other big advantage of 3D echo is that you're not dependent on a particular shape of the ventricle. We usually assume that the ventricle is a prolated ellipse. If you have segmental wall motion abnormalities, etc., you are going to miss them unless you use 3D echo. Now, a couple of words. There are many studies in the literature, and our group has done also quite many of these, in which we compare 3D echo against cardiac MRI. And I think it's very important to understand two things. One is that the correlation between cardiac MRI and 3D echo is excellent. But if you look at this very carefully, 3D echo always continues to minimally underestimate the volumes. So that means that 3D echo gives you volumes that are slightly smaller than the MRIs. And let me briefly show you why. This is a very simple experiment. If you put an egg in a glass of water and you image with a transducer, you know the amount of water that got displaced, so you know what the volume of that egg was. And then you take these images and you just trace them, and you see that you cannot even see differences, but just minimal changes in the position of where you trace can result in up to about 11–15% change in the volumes. And that, if you take this into consideration, you know, this is a sort of a relatively good 3D echo in which you can see the limit between the compacted and the non-compacted myocardium. And that is where we would like to trace. But many times, 3D echo, we don't see that, so you can see that we usually tend to draw our borders in, and that's why we get smaller values than MRI. So left ventricular volumes by 3D, these are the normal. And today when we do it, start paying attention. 79 for men and 71 for women, milliliters per meter square for end diastolic. And for end systolic, it's 32 and 28. These are the normal values. The European Society of Echo is now going to publish a huge study of about 700 people, also to add more credence to these type of numbers. So in summary, I would like to tell you that the advantages of 3D echo is that we avoid foreshortening. We don't have any geometry assumptions. We are more accurate and reproducible. The disadvantages, and these are part of the gaps, is that we still would like to improve our temporal resolution. And today, when we demonstrate, start paying attention to the frame rate, because that has a sort of quite a lot of impact on your accuracy. And we have less data on normals, but I think that when somebody writes the new guidelines in 10 years, it's going to be predominantly 3D. And there are a lot of studies now going on to obtain normal values. So let me tell you, this is part of the big gaps, is that despite all of these advantages of 3D echo, very few people measure. If I would ask in the room, in how many of your labs you just measure volumes using 3D echo, there are going to be very few of you that will lift up your hand. And the main reason for that are numerous, but doing 3D echo, if you don't know what you're doing, can be time consuming. It requires time to do this 3D analysis. The accuracy can vary if you do it a lot or you do it once every week. And there is quite a lot of problems with reproducibility. So in a way, one of the things that you're going to see out of this meeting, and independently of any type of vendor, is that there is a major trend to try to obtain everything that we do with echocardiography automatically, with minimal interaction between the data and you to make measurements. So this is one of the efforts here. This is a full volume, and what we would like eventually is to press a button in a computer, and we're going to show it to you later in the day. You can automatically define from this 3D echo the volumes and end diastole and systole of the chambers of the heart. This idea of using an automated model segmentation of the heart has existed before. This existed with CT. It definitely existed with MRI, and only now all of the vendors are trying to do this with three-dimensional echo data, which is more difficult because it's more difficult to find the borders. One of the ways to do this would be to put into a computer like 1,000 3D echoes with different types of shapes, create a generic model, and then when you put into the computer a particular heart, this generic model adapts to this, produce a local adaptation, and you create a final type of model. And this is in a nutshell how this works. It initially aligns and orients, it adjusts the border, it avoids geometrical assumptions, and it sort of works. And you'll see a lot of the vendors have different ways of approaching this. Let me just tell you, you all know that the heart has different shapes. You can have a dilated heart. You many times have these banana-shaped hearts, a sigmoid predominant or bulging septum, or you have a normal heart. So these models need to adapt to all of these particular shapes. And we would like, ideally, to automatically obtain the volumes of all of these chambers in maybe less than a minute or something like that. So the other thing that the guidelines now, and we will demonstrate this and people will talk about this, it is more difficult to do, but it's very interesting, is to calculate the right ventricular volumes using 3D echo. And this is also now, there is enough normal data in the literature that we can recommend normal values for volumes and ejection fraction of the right ventricle. So in keeping with things that we can do with the left ventricle, we have also the calculation of LV mass. For years, we calculated LV mass from M-mode echo using the formula of Devereux, and that is still recommended because there is so much in the literature about that. There are 2D methods, usually the area length or the truncated ellipsoid method, and these are recommended and have advantages but are more sort of difficult to do. And from these M-mode echo, we all know how we have studied remodeling of the heart, looking at concentric remodeling, concentric hypertrophy, eccentric hypertrophy, and normal geometry by establishing a ratio between the long axis of the left ventricle and the thickness of the posterior wall. Now, ideally, we would like to have a method, and this is again one of the gaps, to measure LV mass using 3D echo. Unfortunately, these normal values are less well established, and you need a lot of cooperation with the patient in order to do it, and this is definitely not recommended. You're going to hear a lot about global longitudinal strain. Just because of the guidelines, let me tell you that after a major fight, we came up with the normal values is -20. So -20, -21, -22 is good. Less than that is a decline in strain, and we're going to hear a lot about this in the meeting. Let me tell you that in the guidelines, we recommend only the use of global longitudinal strain. Regional strain is not recommended. And then we can actually do the experiment. There is a difference between vendors which has been more and more decreasing. But if you measure with one machine strain, you might get another number with the other one because all of the vendors use different software to measure strain. So that results in certain differences. And the regional deformation or the regional strain is not recommended. Let me just briefly tell you that we have the normal, we have now really talked about how these segments should be called, and a lot of people have, not a lot of people, some prominent people have some problems, but this is what we came as a group. And then we also have described the perfusion territories, which is very important for stress echo. So in summary, when we talk about 3D echo, let me tell you that we have now established reference ranges for left ventricular volumes and ejection fraction, as well as LA volumes. Left ventricular wall motion scoring system has changed to a 4-grade system. For the first time, 3D echo is now recommended for the left and right ventricular volumes. And if global longitudinal strain is to be used, it's important at this time and stage that we should do that using the same vendor machine and analysis package. So I think it's a sort of a very exciting time because For the first time, 3D echo is now being recommended. So we're going to hear a little bit more about the different chambers, and then we're going to show how this can be done. Thank you very much.